as a young woman of color in the labor movement, I know that that was something that was really important to me. I came to AFSCME right out of college, and at first I didn't know the history of Martin Luther King and the 1968 strike in Memphis, and so learning about that even after joining the labor movement was just such an important part of feeling that I belong in the labor movement, and that no matter what issue you're advocating on or what community you're trying to build, that is such an important aspect of building community. So thank you for telling those stories. So what did you find, how can I say this, most rewarding about writing, whether it's in the book or just in your writing in general? What do you find most rewarding?
The thing that thrills me and makes me so just happy and energized and grateful is when workers are able to see their stories get out there. And when I'm able to hand a microphone to someone, because I'm not the expert, the people doing the work are the experts. It's my job to hand them this microphone, hand them a platform, and have them tell the story of what's happening to them, what their struggle is, what they're fighting for. And seeing it work, seeing other people pay attention and donate to their strike funds and buy t-shirts and show support and say, oh, I didn't know this was happening. I didn't know these workers are having such a hard time. I didn't know these workers existed. And I was like, okay, well, yeah, they're making our world run. Show them a little respect, show them a little love. Like seeing it work, basically. Seeing my role as this sort of microphone stand for the people work and see them get the support they need. That's what gets me up in the morning.
So you talk a lot in your book about the disability movement, and you give some examples about where some other unions were able to build in coalition with the disability movement. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about coalition building.
That was one of my favorite chapters because it was the one I knew the least about going in, because even as a disabled person who is a labor activist who is part of a union, I didn't know that much about the intersections. Like, I knew they must have been there, but there's such a tendency, I think, when it comes to talking about different social and political movements to silo them off, be like, this is the civil rights movement, this is disability rights, this is women's rights, this is queer and trans rights, but it's all the same people doing all the same stuff. Like, people that were in community with one another, just like they are now. And so one of my favorite parts of the disability chapter, there's all the chapters are my favorite, but that one, I love all my children. But one of my favorite stories from that chapter was, so the Section 504 protests. This is 1977. Essentially, without getting into all the nitty-gritty of the details, the government had said it was going to enact this law, the Rehabilitation Act, that would have basically given disabled people civil rights. For the first time, it was the first civil rights legislation aimed at disabled people. And the government was dragging its heels, because of course they were. And disabled activists had enough of it, and they organized. There were a lot of disability rights groups at that point, and one of them decided, okay, well, if you won't come to us, we're gonna come to you. And they occupied a bunch of federal buildings across the country, most significantly in San Francisco, where a group of disabled activists, predominantly led by queer women and black folks, they occupied a federal building for 26 days. Yeah, that was the longest federal occupation in history, and is led by disabled folks, which is something that is just so cool. I just love knowing that, because it's like, oh yeah, we did that. And the reason they're able to sustain that for so long is because they had strong community support with other organizations. Local churches helped. The Black Panthers were a huge part of why they're able to sustain that, because a couple of the disabled folks who were leading the protest were also Black Panthers. So they fed the people. When it came time for some of the leaders of the protest to go out to DC to talk to Congress, a lot of them used mobility aids, used wheelchairs. This was before the ADA. This is before anything was accessible to anybody. And so they showed up and they needed to get places, and the International Union, the Machinist Union, they showed up with a box truck and some rope. We're like, okay, it might not be comfortable, but we're gonna figure it out. We're gonna get you where you need to go. And they offered them office space and resources. It was a really incredible confluence of different movements that showed that they were all part of the same movement. And I just love talking about that one because it's just really badass, right?
Yes, it is. And it's such an important story because I promise if there are people in workplaces right now that are feeling oppressed, feeling down, and feeling like, oh, someone might retaliate against me, or I don't have enough activists in my workplace. But when you hear inspiring stories like that, how can you not join together and, you know, stand up for what you believe in when you hear these folks who, you know, had an amazing challenge in front of them, but still took over a building for 26 days, right?
And they won.
Like, yeah.
That's the thing, too. Like, they were together and they won. And that's, I mean, labor's generally, it sometimes feels like we're on the back foot a lot. But that doesn't mean that we have to be like that forever. It doesn't mean that we haven't won. There are so many incredible victories. Like, every step of progress that has been taken in this country has been because of workers and poor folks, the working class, people in unions, people not in unions, but people coming together and saying, you know, we've had enough of this bullshit. We're going to do something about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So that brings me to my next question, which is, what did you find most challenging to write about?
So, okay. So in terms of, well, there's two answers I'll give you. In terms of the book specifically, one of the toughest chapters for me to really research and flesh out and put together was chapter 13, the incarcerated workers. Because for one thing, I couldn't just pick up the phone and call some of my sources the way I did for other chapters because they're being kept in cages and do not have that freedom. And in addition, it was just kind of harder to find material on that kind of organizing, on that kind of struggle, because there's the siloing off of like the prisoners' rights movement and the labor movement. They have absolutely intersected throughout the years, sometimes very explicitly. But actually, shout out to the U.S. government once again in you know, another theme of this book. In 1977, a Supreme Court case, Jones versus the North Carolina Prisoners Labor Union case, that came around and essentially stripped incarcerated workers of their rights to organize, to join a union, to be treated as workers, even though, as we know, there's millions of people in this country who go to work every day. They're either paid pennies or paid nothing because prison slavery still exists in this country. And that is a labor issue. It has always been a labor issue. And it's just been sometimes difficult to dig up those intersections because not everyone has seen it that way. And as someone who very much does, I had to put a little bit more elbow grease into making that very clear when I had the chance to write about my book.
Yeah. I'm curious, you know, again, as a labor educator and talking with leaders around the country from different regions, rural areas, cities, people have different ideologies, and labor movements are oftentimes reflective of society in terms of, you know, party affiliation and things like that. So I'm curious to hear about any of the support or resistance that you experienced while writing a book on labor, from labor leaders or people who are not, you know, who are unorganized.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, I kind of made sure to talk to people who I knew were kind of on the same page as me. Because I was like, it's my book. I don't have to talk to a bunch of nerds. Like, I approached this with a very specific viewpoint and agenda, honestly. Like, I don't necessarily care what high-level union officials think about what I'm writing. I care about what the workers whose lives are reflected in it think, right? And even in chapters like, for the disability rights chapter, the disabled workers chapter, everyone I interviewed for that chapter was disabled because we know our own stories. When it comes, there's a chapter on sex work, and everyone I interviewed for that was either a current or former sex worker. And I hired a friend who's a sex worker to do a sensitivity read to make sure I didn't screw anything up. Because the same thing for the incarcerated workers chapter. I had a friend who was incarcerated while I was writing it, read through it after and make sure I didn't screw up any of his quotes. So yeah, I guess that's just sort of the freedom of writing a book, right? Like, I don't have to talk to the people that don't see things the same way as I do, and they don't have to buy my book. Live and let live, right?
Yeah. Well, I will say, as a person inside of the labor movement, I appreciate folks like you as well to write those stories. And also, it's all about centering the people who are most impacted, right?
Yes.
And so that's exactly what you were able to do in this book. So I appreciate that. And even with your approach to, it sounds like, you know, interviewing people and doing the writing and then hiring someone to check your work, right? Knowing that you may not necessarily be the most impacted person. That's just, I think, a great way to go about your work. So, the stories that we learn about in your book, I'll say this, the stories that we learn about labor movements or any movement in general, they shape the way that we think about those impacted people. And so for labor, there are a lot of folks out there who think, labor unions are for old white men who, might get in trouble at work. We don't need a labor union at our nonprofit or at my museum or, in any type of work. So what would you say to people who think like that or who think that labor unions aren't for them?
Here's the thing. If you have a boss, you need a union. Like, that is the bottom bare bones line. Because even if you have the nicest boss in the world, which, it's amazing you found him. I didn't know he existed. But if you have if you happen to be excited about, if you have a good relationship with your boss, you love your work, everything's going great, that could all disappear in a second if someone else makes that decision. If you don't have a union contract, if you don't have that strong shop floor solidarity, if you don't have a strong movement of workers there to make sure they don't fuck things up, then they can do whatever they want. Even right now we're seeing this big resurgence of interest in labor organizing and strikes and activity, which is incredible to see. And a lot of that is coming from folks who are not in the same, white dude with a hard hat category as my dad. And, I love him, but he's not there on the front lines right now. Workers at Starbucks, workers in museums, workers in nonprofits, journalism, medieval times, like literally, it's almost as if so many other workers have kind of woken up and been like, oh, so we can do this too? Like, I used to think of things that way when I was working at Vice, because when I was I write about death metal on the internet. Like, there's not a Metalheads Local 666 for me. Like, that's not something I thought was in the cards. But then it turns out there was. Like, there was a union that, maybe not specifically my specific little job, but there are unions for writers and journalists and editors. Like, there's a kind of a union for everybody. And if there isn't a union for your job, just make one. Like, you're allowed. Independent unions exist. And as we saw with the success of the Amazon Labor Union, they're a very valid option. Like, there are a lot of different ways to be a union and a lot of different ways to be a union member, and they all count.
Yes.
Just do it.
I love it. So for my last question today is, given your deep dive into labor history, what do you see as the future of the labor movement? And, what lessons can these leaders sitting here today take from those giants that you wrote about in your book?
The future of labor and the future of the movement is young, diverse, Black, brown, queer, trans, indigenous, disabled. Like, all the people I wrote about in my book who have been leading the charge for centuries, that's who's leading it right now. That is the most important thing to bear in mind, is that organizing across identity lines, across every racial, gender, ability, country of origin, linguistic, everything that you might see as something that might separate you from other workers, that is a strength. Mm-hmm. That is something that you can use and build on to find common ground, to build solidarity, to just become stronger, to become one unit, to realize it's us. It's not me and you, it's us against them.
Yes.
And this is how we win. This is how we've won, throughout history. One of my favorite little examples that I like to mention, back in 1946, the sugarcane strike. So, Cliff Notes. You can read the whole thing if you come to the artist space after. But 1946, at that point in Hawaii, the islands, the major economy was based around sugarcane plantations. People that owned it, white guys, lived on the mainland. People that worked on it, immigrants from a variety of Asian countries, Native Hawaiians, Puerto Ricans, a huge mishmash of races and cultures and languages. And they had a union, and at certain points throughout the history of that relationship, the bosses would use the fact that workers were from different places to pit them against each other, have Filipino workers break a Japanese workers' strike. Same thing happening with Korean workers. They tried to keep people apart. They had them in segregated camps. They paid them differently. They tried to drive home the "you are different" idea. But then in 1946, when it came time to strike, the union saw that. It was like, okay, we can't let them split us apart like this again. And they threw all of their energy into bringing people together by making sure that a variety of languages were spoken at every meeting. People understood and were able to feel heard. They put together strike kitchens where people shared their food and recipes and built community that way. They made it clear, like, it's us against them. And they won. They won the biggest raise in 20 years. And they still have an incredibly strong union there, the ILWU, International Longshore Warehouse Workers Union, because they refuse to be split apart. And that's the most basic lesson. There's more of us than there are of them, and we are so much stronger when we work together.
Yes.
Oh, perfect.
Well, Kim, I just want to say again, thank you so much for telling those untold stories and for writing in a way that helps people like me see themselves in the labor movement. And I hope that you all were able to take some gems from this discussion today. So thank you all, and make sure to stop by I'm trying to remember which room it is. It's right back here to the left-hand
Little
side.
artist space? Yeah,
The artist space?
I think that's what it's called.
The artist space.
Activist space. That's the one.
Activist
See,
space. There you go.
You guys know.
To pick up Kim Kelly's book. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.